Hey folks, today's video we're going to start to cover a little bit more about in-depth skills that are used by concept artists and illustrators. I'm going to start with something that I feel is really important to cover early on because it catches a lot of people out early in their career, myself included. That age-old question, what is my style? Art style very loosely means the way in which an artist chooses to present their work, whether it be in comics, fine art paintings, pencil sketches, whatever. In a nutshell, I think we can summarise by saying that style is a consistent system of decision making. By that, I mean that an artist who has a particular style will consistently make decisions about how they represent what they're illustrating. These decisions can come from any aspect of the artwork, such as how they use composition, whether they draw lines, how they handle edges and colours, and what subject matter they choose. We're going to discuss style in terms of illustration. In this egg painting by Marcello Berenghi, the artist was concerned with hyperrealism, so his decisions were made to represent everything that he could observe directly. The Star Wars concept art by Ralph McQuarrie moves further away, but still tries to capture a realistic look, and his skills are such that it's very successful. In this Deathloop artwork by one of my favourite artists, Sergei Kolosov, a great number of deliberate choices were made to create an image which does not look like reality. We can analyse this as a style by looking at those decisions, such as his use of hard edges, bold sharp shapes, a limited palette and silhouettes. This results in a recognisable style that we can look at and immediately know who the artist is. The more stylised a painting is, the more careful the artist must be to consider every aspect critically. This is not to say that realistic observational painting is any way less than, but it requires a different skill set. In games and media, having a style that is recognisable is a surefire way to set yourself apart from the crowd. If you can refine your decision-making process to create a style that is versatile and appealing, you will garner a strong following. It may sound simple, but it requires a lot of studying, consuming art you admire, and learning fundamentals. After all, being able to create a unique vision of reality requires an extraordinary grasp of reality in itself, so that you can bend the rules in just the right ways. One powerful study that we can do to practice that decision-making process is a material study. Today, I'm going to show you how I might go about doing a material study and create a shorthand that I can quickly recall to make some fun video game assets. So let's begin. We're going to study 3 common materials that I find in video games: gold, stone, and leather. We're going to break them down into their components that make them very recognisable, and do some abstraction to create new things such as these video game assets using what we've observed. So first we have stone. This ball follows the classic value structure you would study when learning basic forms, with highlight and shadow. But what makes this look like stone? We can break this into 3 components: colour, reflectivity, and texture. The colour of this stone is a desaturated and earthy grey, with lots of browns and reds. It's not very reflective. We do have a bright specular highlight on the top, so it certainly isn't a matte finish, but we can't see a reflection. The texture is the final component that sells it as stone. It has a rough, uneven surface that creates the appearance of rock immediately. I stylise this by using the observed colours and values and hard edges to create triangular shapes for the texture. Notice that I take notes before I begin and then draw. This is so that I have something to base my work on. Next, we have the gold ball. Let's address the colour. We have this overall warm yellow hue, but if we drew a yellow ball, it wouldn't be very convincing as gold. So let's look at the values. The form of the ball in this case is not described by a classic sphere value distribution. Instead, because the surface is highly reflective, you can see in the environment in which the ball exists, and the highlights and shadows are exaggerated greatly, all toned yellow. The reflections overwhelm the form shadows, but we can still read the shape because they are distorted in a way that describes the form. They wrap around the sphere. Finally, for this study, we have leather, a common fantasy material. The same questions again. We start with a ruddy brown colour, with lots of warm hues and desaturated highlight area that moves cooler. It's more reflective than stone, but not as much as gold. We can see the reflections of lights more clearly, like that blue highlight. Finally, the texture is uneven, due to the natural properties of leather, it has pores, subtle variations in colour, and its construction requires stitching, which adds to the recognisable surface texture. I start my study with those warm hues and add a cool highlight with a textured brush to simulate the surface. Then, adding the highlights in a bright value and the stitches with a hard edge, it completes the study in the same style as the others. Now that we've come up with a shorthand to represent these materials, let's put it to use and see if we can make what we've learned into something new. I'll start with stone by drawing a statue. My decision-making process here is to represent changes in value and colour with hard-edged shapes, minimal blending and an exaggerated texture. I'll start with the base tone and silhouette of the statue. Next, I add those cool shadows that we identified in the study and carve out the forms that I want to see. I add a warm bounce light which gives a more feeling of form, and it's attractive contrasting to the cool shadows. Next, the gold. Let's do a skull. I start again with a base colour in the mid-tone and block in my silhouette. I then add some shadow shapes to represent reflections, keeping the 3D surface of the skull in mind so that they wrap around it convincingly. Some bright highlights sell the material even more, and warm areas in the shadows bring it together nicely. Finally, a fantasy pouch. Using all the same principles, we render this again in the same style, starting with a mid-tone silhouette and building the forms with hard shapes. Remembering to add stitches where possible, and use those cool highlights and warm shadows. Now that I've done those studies and applied my learning, I feel much more ready to paint these materials from my imagination. Studying is all about asking questions of your observations and answering them with your work. In this way, I found that representing materials with hard shapes creates an attractive representation that doesn't require hours of rendering. I would really recommend you study some materials and apply your findings to something new. Over time, you'll create a selection of materials that you can recall at a moment, and you'll find your own style as you do it. Let me know in your comments what your favourite material to draw is. For me, it's gold. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing and giving it a like. If you really want to support me, I have a Patreon where you can access early videos and much more. There's a link for that in the description. Thanks for watching, Ed.